Everyday Imperfect, where we share ways to blend our faith, as imperfect as it is, into our everyday. We know that there will be times when we have bad days and hard questions, and we want you to know it's okay to have imperfect faith. We have a perfect God. And it may sound a little simplistic, but if your faith needs a little boost today or every day, sit back, crank those AirPods up, and borrow a cup of imperfect faith from us today. Let's go. Hey guys, before we jump into today's topic, I want to ask you a favor, and if you can, just screenshot your phone or device where you are listening to our podcast and post it on your socials so that your friends can find us a little bit easier. Just let us know that you are listening. And hey, if you want to put hashtag Everyday Imperfect on there just so I can check it out later and maybe comment on your social, then that'll be awesome. We can connect that way. So today we are talking about labels. We are going to try to define what labels we have lived with and which ones are really necessary or which ones may be beneficial. A little thing about me, I have always been an office supply nerd. I will admit that readily. And my husband will tell you that I love to go, of all places, to Office Depot or the school supply section in Target or Walmart or even CVS or Walgreens. I am a pen freak. I have more planners than probably I need to admit, and I've got nearly every color of Sharpie marker and highlighter. And by the way, if you haven't tried Mr. Pen's Bible highlighters that you can get on Amazon, you are missing out. Just FYI. I love organization, or at least the thought of it. Although I'll admit that my office at work is a lot more organized than my home generally is, especially my personal spaces. I love colored folders and binders, and I love labeling it all. In fact, I have a label maker at work and a label maker at home. Although, to be fair, I think the sound guys at church use my label maker at home more than I have been lately. So I love having things organized. Everything has a place and everything in its place. And if you're not sure where it goes, make a label and create a space. Of course, I haven't always been that way. My mama and my sister can definitely testify about my messiness in my teenage years. But over the years, I found a bit of security in keeping things nice and tidy and uncluttered. Sorting, organizing, labeling, and starting the process over again when life gets too messy. So labels can be a very helpful thing. Labeling cleaners or chemicals or art supplies, that's definitely pretty necessary. But a nasty habit that we've gotten into these last couple of decades is placing labels on ourselves. And if we're honest, placing labels on other people. Back when I was a kid in the 80s, I remember seeing my older foster sister and cousins living out the whole declaration from the 80s that you can't put a label on me, I'm an individual. And now it's like we're almost leaning the other way. It's almost like people are begging to belong to a label. We don't feel like we belong unless we have a label like another person, whether it's wearing the label of millennial or Gen X or hetero or homo, transgendered or cisgendered, which, by the way, in case you were like me and didn't know this, apparently is the label for those wanting to live as the gender they were born as. You may want to wear the label as a trad wife or feminist, maybe a Republican or a Democrat, especially here in this election year that we're recording in right now. How about religious versus spiritual? Now, obviously, this isn't a new problem, so to speak. And in the Bible, you can find tons of examples of people being labeled, and that label actually limiting them and their effectiveness. Jews were labeled, for example, by the Romans. as being less than. I mean, and that definitely limited their freedoms in that culture. Tax collectors were labeled as being enemies of the Jews, or people in general, I would guess. That's why when Jesus called Matthew to be a disciple, even though he was a tax collector, it was so shocking to everyone. What about the Samaritan woman that Jesus met at the well in John 4? Not only was she a Samaritan, remember, the Jews wouldn't associate with the Samaritans because they disagreed on where they would worship God, among other things. But also, she was a woman who had been married several times and was labeled by her own people as undesirable and outcast. And I'm sure that there were other labels that she had to deal with. Why else would she have come to the well in the middle of the day to avoid being there with other women? She was wearing a label that she probably didn't even ask for, to be honest. Society had labeled her. Her past had labeled her. And I think her own actions lived up or maybe down to that label as well. I mean, she even cut herself off from society because of it. Again, we know this because she was at the well at midday instead of in the morning, in the cool of the morning, when most of the other women would be drawing their household water. She was a lady that other women would whisper about as she passed by, whether it was true or not. You know how that can be. She was the one who was so desperate to fill whatever it was she was missing that she was okay with going from one man to the next, desperately seeking that fulfillment that she had been longing for. In fact, she altered her habits and behaviors based on that label that she wore, further accepting society's judgment of her. Oh, she knew church. She knew tradition. She wasn't stupid or unlearned. She knew what church meant for her and her people, and she even challenged Jesus with a theological question to show that. We read this story, and so many of us think about this poor woman. Oh, how sad. She was so far gone, and she had lost all hope. But honestly, I think that you and I might just have more in common with her than we probably want to admit. The truth is, we are all that woman at the well. Every one of us is that woman.
Hey friend, I just want to let you know about something that I think is pretty special. There's a new way for you to get even more out of being a part of the Everyday Imperfect family. Check the show notes to find out how you can help be a sponsor of the podcast by joining our Patreon group of supporters. There's an added bonus content that you can discover on every level of giving. Would you consider helping us to get this message out to all the other imperfect people just like us?
We are all that woman at the well. Maybe you haven't had 5 husbands and are currently living with a man who's not your husband. But we have all had a label or a limit that, if we're honest, we have allowed to keep us from the arms of Jesus at some point in our lives. You know, it might very well be that the label that the woman at the well was wearing was something that she couldn't even help. There are several theologians that will tell you that the only time most women were put away or divorced in biblical times was when they could not have children. So what if this woman at the well was in this position because she was having to wear a label of barren or infertile? Maybe you're having to wear a label like that. Maybe it's your past that you're allowing to define you. Maybe it's that something that someone else has done to you, not necessarily something you've done to yourself, that's caused you to be limited or labeled. Maybe your label is your struggle with addiction, whether it's alcohol, drugs, nicotine, vape, porn, food, gossip. Maybe you had your life all figured out, and one wrong turn turned into 2, then 3, and before you knew it, you were so far from the will of God that you didn't even recognize your own label anymore. Maybe your label has been friend of God for some time, but maybe when you go to church, you just don't feel anything anymore. And you're watching all these people getting blessed and Holy Spirit raining down, and you are just there. And before you know it, your label has less to do with being on fire and more to do with just watching other people in the fire. But there's one thing that we tend to forget about this woman that Jesus had to go meet at the well, and also that we forget about ourselves. And that is that in spite of the limits or the labels, the mistakes, in spite of the times that she tried to pick herself back up and start all over, in spite of all those times that she tried to live up to her own label and even tried to possibly relabel herself, he knew her. He saw her. More than likely at this point, for the first time in her life at that well, she felt noticed for who she was, not for her label. He saw her for who she was right then and still offered her that living water. Friend, he knows you. He sees you. He sees past the labels that you've been wearing, and he sees the tears and the fear and the worry and the anxiety. He knows that you've had sleepless nights and lonely car rides and showers that are just long enough to hide your tears from the rest of your family. He sees and he knows. So can I just encourage you today, whenever it is that you're listening to this podcast, let's lay down those labels, those limits. The labels we wear, whether they were put there by ourselves or other people, and the labels that we stick on other people. Because even though labels help sometimes, they can also hinder, and the wrong labels can limit. So let's lay down those wrong labels, those labels that have already been placed under the blood of Jesus, and pick up the labels that he gives us. Lay down that label of failure and pick up his label of sufficient grace. Lay down the label of sinner and pick up his label of forgiven. Lay down the label of addict and pick up his label of free. Lay down that label of holier than thou and pick up his label of imperfect believer. I guess what I'm trying to encourage us all to do, to be, is just be who God made you to be. You know, God is smart. And my husband has told so many people, youth and adults alike, that for years and years in our ministry. God is smart. And when he made you, he knew that there would be times that you'd fail or question or doubt. And as we've told my son for years, it's okay. Learn from it and move on. Don't stay in that place of failure or doubt or sin. If you have to wear a label, wear one that points back to him. He wants you free from the limitations of negative labels because he is the perfect in our imperfect every day.
Hey friend, thank you so much for joining us on today's podcast. Check the show notes for any links and resources we may have mentioned, and please do me a big favor and leave us 5 stars on the podcast platform where you found us. And if you can't give us 5 stars, tell us how we can get those 5 stars. That's how other people can find out about us and the message we're trying to get out, that it's okay for us to be imperfect in our everyday life, because we follow Jesus Christ, who is perfect for us. Also, if you'll go to the Buzzsprout link in the show notes, you can leave me fan mail. That's basically where you tell me what you think about the show and make suggestions for upcoming topics. I can't wait to hear from you. Now, please share this imperfect episode with your imperfect friends and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode releasing soon.